Now we're going to start with my favorite section, Mesoamerica. And just really quickly, Mesoamerica starts around mid-Mexico, modern-day Mexico, and stops northern Honduras, El Salvador area here. Encompasses all of Guatemala, all of Belize, Yucatan Peninsula, southern Mexico, centralish Mexico. And then this particular map, it's showing you the extent of the Aztec Empire, and then in this greenish color is kind of the Mayan world. We have some different kinds of environments here. We have tropical lowlands in some of the areas over here. Gets a little drier up here, but we've got highlands, as you can see, all the way through here, which is going to give us a somewhat cooler environment. Now, during the Pleistocene, we have Paleo-Indian foragers, and in the Americas, we refer to Neolithic peoples as Paleo-Indians. And so they're foragers very similar to the Clovis culture, which we looked at briefly when we talked about peopling of the Americas. We do find sites with megafauna that have been butchered. They did occupy quite a wide range of environments, and that's the actual people, not necessarily the megafauna themselves. But we do see that in this particular area of Mesoamerica, they are primarily foragers until about 4500 BP. However, during this Archaic period, which is around 9000 to 4500 BP, we see some trends. We see decreased reliance on hunting. So we find lower frequencies of animal bone, particularly deer, in the archaeological record. Now keep in mind this could be a preservation bias also. It's pre-ceramic, so we don't have any ceramics during this time frame. We see decreased mobility, increased use of riverine resources or aquatic resources, increased population, which kind of goes along with decreased mobility. We see the establishment of long-distance trade routes. So we see maize, seashells. We find obsidian all over the place. We find that these pan-regional contacts that are established here in the Archaic period are actually pretty instrumental in the development of later cultures. And then also in this Archaic period, during the whole time, we see an increased reliance on plants. So we have this interesting trends happening during this Archaic period. Now, a couple of sites that are pretty important for the Archaic period are Gila Nikitz and Coxcatlan Cave. So Gila Nikitz is in the Oaxaca area. Sorry about that, I clicked the wrong thing. And then Coxcatlan Cave is right over here. Modern day Mexico City is here to help you orient yourself. So at Gila Nikitz, which again is in Oaxaca, we first see evidence of a habitation at 10,000 BP. Most of this work was done by a guy by the name of Kent Flannery. He's done extensive research in the Oaxacan Valley. He found evidence of a mixed subsistence. So we see wild animals like deer and rabbit, and we see wild plants, but we do start to see then domesticated plants coming in also. So we find like bottle gourds. So this might be why we don't find ceramics during the Archaic period, is that people were using these gourds for storage instead of pottery. We find squash, we find evidence of sunflower, and we also find evidence of maize, which we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a second. Now at Coxcatlan Cave, this is where Scotty McNeish worked for a long period of time, and this is in the Tehuacan Valley, over here again, and occupations from 7,000 to 5,400 BP, and we found the remnants of baskets, fiber soles for sandals, mats, ropes for nets and snares. We find use of the maguey cactus, so we find sap from the stalk, and this could have been used for liquid during the dry season. We find evidence that the roots were roasted, so somewhat like a sweet potato. And then we also find the prickly pear cactus, or the nopal, and we can find mesquite seeds also. So again, lots of different things being used very early on in the Archaic period. Now maize, the reason we're going to talk a little bit about it is because it is the staple crop, and it really formed the foundation for all of the cultures that developed here. So it shows up in many different ways. It shows up in their ideology, and many of the origin stories from this area claim that people are made at least partly from maize. Many of the groups consider the face of the world as a maize field. And then we also see kind of maize gods. This happens to be let's see if I can remember the name, Yamkash from the Maya world. And you can see he's got his corn here, and he is considered a corn deity. So we often see sacrificial rituals that replicate or mirror the life cycle of corn. And some people have suggested that beheading is actually a metaphor for the harvest of maize. And most of the cultures here, if you weren't a maize farmer, at least, reliant on maize farming, then you weren't necessarily respectable. Now, the scientific name for domesticated maize is Z maize. The likeliest ancestor for domesticated maize is Teosinte. Now, the earliest domesticated, and this is actually a picture of Teosinte, so it was a wild kind of grass there. The earliest maize was really, really small, so you can actually see it right here. It's not any bigger than a pinky. But within 1,000 years, they increased the size of it. It spread all over Mesoamerica. And again, that's another good indication of these trade relationships that are developing. Now, as time passes, 2 other domesticated plants become prominent, and there's a specific reason for that. And many of the Southwest U.S. groups kind of refer to them as the 3 sisters. And so we've got corn, squash, and beans. And why these 3 particular plants? Well, it's because they actually are pretty nutritionally balanced. And they go together. What one gives you or doesn't give you, another one gives you, and so forth. And they can actually be grown all together in one agricultural field, which is referred to as polycropping. So you have the corn growing on stalks, you have the beans, which then use the stalks of corn as runners, and then you've got squash filling in all of the bottom. And what nutrients beans takes out of the soil, corn puts back in, and vice versa. So these really work well together. Lots of plants, over 100 plants domesticated in Mesoamerica. Here's just a few of them. We have a variety of peppers, different kinds of squash like pumpkin here. We have the zapote, avocado, tomatoes. I mean, we could go on and on and on. Lots of different plants here. Animals, not so many. We have the turkey, and I've always kind of liked this picture because it reminds me of the Aliens movie with the thing coming out of the chest, but that's just an aside. Then dogs. And we find that dogs were used for food, but we also find them in burials. And then the honeybee is actually domesticated there. So they keep the hives by fallowing fields, and nowadays harvesting honey is a cash crop. Now, what's really interesting about Mesoamerica is that domestication occurs long before people settled into a sedentary lifestyle. So we don't see true sedentism until the end of this Archaic period, but the domesticated plants show up thousands of years earlier. That's different than every other place on the planet. The sedentism comes first. We don't see large animals or domesticated animals until the Spanish arrived, because they simply didn't have them in Mesoamerica.